Empires do not collapse only because of storms or markets. They collapse when a single underestimated farm kid overturns the board. And it took 12-year-old James Carter, son of a forgotten farmer in Tulia, Texas, to make the first move. The wind on the plains carried dust and the faint sweetness of cut hay. It blew across cracked earth, bent stalks of cotton, and barns that seemed older than their roofs. At the edge of town, a lantern burned inside a weathered shed. Its glow was modest, but to the boy crouched within it, the light was enough. Shadows stretched long across a flour sack unrolled over a wooden crate, and on that sack, lines had been drawn to make 64 squares. The board was crude, but it was his. The pieces were scavenged. Rooks shaped from rusted bolts, pawns from shirt buttons, bishops from washers worn smooth by years of use. The knights were different. Carved wood, heavy with care, gifted by Mr. Harris, the retired math teacher who still lingered around Tulia's school like a benevolent ghost. James held those knights as if they were relics. They smelled faintly of cedar and chalk dust, the two scents that defined Mr. Harris's life. James's hands were calloused, cut from wire and plow, yet when he moved a piece, his fingers softened, precise. His eyes carried something that rarely belonged to 12 years of age: patience. He did not see knights or bishops. He saw rivers, pressure, inevitability. He looked at the board as he looked at irrigation ditches on the farm. The water would find its course, but only if guided. Chess, to him, was water. Outside the barn, the Carter farm lay under siege of drought. Wells were low. The aquifer coughed sand. Notices from the bank had begun stacking on the kitchen table, letters that bent his father's shoulders more than any tractor ever had. His mother stretched meals thinner and thinner, patched clothes until fabric itself gave up. The farm was not yet dead, but it no longer lived. It lingered, like an old horse still standing in the field, bones showing beneath the hide. James knew all this. He did not carry it like a burden, but like gravity, always there, shaping every step. He played chess against that gravity. Sometimes, in the still of night, when the cicadas hummed loud enough to drown his father's sighs through the walls, he whispered moves from memory. Capablanca's endings, Fisher's attacks, lines from books Mr. Harris had pressed into his hands as if passing down contraband. He learned them not for trophies, not for glory. He learned them to prove silently that thought could grow even in soil left for dead. The week of the county fair, Thomas Carter slid a bank notice aside to make space for his mug. He stared at his son for a long moment, then said, "Chess tents open Saturday. You'll go?" James nodded. His mother added softly, "Be polite. Let them see you're more than dirt under your nails." Her tone was tender, but the plea beneath it was sharp. They needed someone, somewhere, to notice him. Not as a Carter boy, not as another hand to pick weeds, but as a mind. The morning of the fair broke with sun that baked dust into the air. James wore a shirt too small, sleeves stopping short of his wrists. He carried the flour sack board under one arm. The fair smelled of fried dough, grease, and hay. Amid tractors and proud displays of prize cattle stood a tent filled with folding tables, plastic chess sets, and townsfolk curious to see a farm boy try his luck. His first opponent was Connor, Amarillo banker's nephew, neat hair, polished shoes, polo collar crisp. Connor barely touched James's hand at the handshake. He played 1.E4, the classic opening of men who assume the board is theirs by birthright. James replied with 1-5, the Sicilian. The crowd leaned closer. 17 moves later, Connor found his queen forked and muttered, "Illegal," as he shoved the pieces aside. The murmurs of the onlookers changed. Respect was slow, but it came. James played 5 more games. He won them all. By late afternoon, the murmur had turned to hush. A black SUV, polished and unfamiliar, pulled up beside the tent. Doors opened with the quiet efficiency of wealth. Out stepped a woman whose dress looked wrong for Tulia, cut sharp for Manhattan rather than dust. Her hair was a controlled cascade of blonde. Her eyes were glass, cold but curious. Laura Kensington. She did not ask permission. She sat opposite James and placed a queen on D1 with the calm authority of someone who had spent her life buying what she wanted. "One game," she said. "If you win, you come to New York. If you lose, you still come. But win, and I will introduce you to Viktor Reznov." The name stopped the air. Reznov, the Russian Grandmaster who had disappeared into the service of billionaires. Legends whispered of him, sacrifices that struck like thunder, endgames written like scripture. He was the ghost in the machine of power, a man who played for men who bought nations. James said nothing. He looked at her queen, then at his bolts and buttons. She opened 1D4. He smiled faintly. He had studied the king's Indian defense. He replied 1, NF6. The fare vanished. The board narrowed. On move 19, James advanced a pawn with the certainty of water being released down a furrow. Laura's position cracked. She resigned without a word, touched her phone and murmured, "Yes, the boy is real." As she rose, she set a card on the table. Harrow Partners, New York. The name was embossed, heavy as iron. Witnesses whispered like wheat in wind. Mr. Harris laid a trembling hand on James's shoulder. Pride and fear twined like roots. That night, the card lay under the kitchen lamp. The serif letters glinted, out of place in the worn house. Thomas Carter said, "These are men who bend the world. They'll try to bend you." His wife whispered, "It's never just a game." James lay in bed, eyes open to the dark. He replayed the game against Laura in the air, pieces invisible but alive. He saw Reznov across from him, towers of glass behind him, and felt the rhythm of water, flowing, inevitable. When sleep came, it was not with victory, but with survival, his family, his town, the dignity of forgotten farmers. The card stayed on the table, heavier than paper, as if the house itself had been challenged to a match it could not refuse. Morning came thin and pale, as if light itself were afraid to spend too much on a house behind on its bills. The card Laura had left, Harrow Partners, New York, still lay on the kitchen table, a square of foreign certainty in a room of worn wood and careful thrift. Coffee steamed. The old wall clock clicked like a cautious metronome. Thomas Carter read the card again, not because he needed the words, but because he mistrusted them. "They'll want something," he said. Men who arrive in black cars always do. James folded his hands around a chipped mug to warm them. His mother pressed a palm to the card as if steadying a bird that might startle and fly. "We can't keep pretending the well is deeper than it is," she said softly. "If a door opens, the boy has to see what's behind it." They ate in that gentle, uneasy way of families who know the price of corn, diesel, and indecision. After breakfast, James took the flour sack board from the barn and rolled it tighter, as if it were a scroll with a prophecy only his fingers could read. He tucked the carved knights into a rag of blue cloth, then set them back. Not yet. Not until the question was answered. The question got answered in the end, in a place that still believed in chalk. Mr. Harris's classroom smelled like old paper and pencil shavings, like the past keeping careful track of itself. The blackboard wore the pale ghosts of previous proofs, rubbed but not forgotten. Mr. Harris had put on his best tie, a humble blue that had seen 2 presidencies and 3 principals. He dialed a number with the gravity of a man consulting a star chart. Laura answered before the second ring. Her voice was brisk, smooth, a Manhattan street paved with appointments. "Good morning, Mr. Harris. And James." She knew his name without being told. James felt it land like a coin on the table, weighty, minted elsewhere. "We can arrange a car to Amarillo on Thursday," she continued. "The afternoon flight to New York. You'll be met at the gate. We'll provide lodging. We'll also provide attire, something suitable for the setting." Mr. Harris straightened. "And I will accompany him." "Naturally," Laura said. "He's a minor. We'll need a consent form from his parents. One more thing." A slight pause. "Please have James bring the set he plays with at home." James looked down at his folded hands. "Why?" he asked, forgetting not to speak into other people's sentences. "Origins," Laura said, as if that explained everything. "We intend to see what he sees, and men like Victor prefer to begin at the beginning." When the call ended, the classroom exhaled. Mr. Harris put the receiver down like a bishop, square by square, careful to keep the piece upright. His eyes shone with a mixture of hope and dread. "We'll do this properly," he said. Properly meant forms at the kitchen table while the clock watched. Thomas read every line, then read them again. The way a farmer reads the sky for signs of a storm other men say is impossible. "Look here," he said, tapping the clause about publicity. "No photographs without our say." "We can strike that," Mr. Harris replied. He made a note in small, precise script. He had once corrected proofs for a scholarly journal in Dallas, before life called him back to small towns and smaller paychecks. His handwriting still marched like Roman legions across a page. James signed where he was told, his name small but legible, as if he wished to interfere as little as possible with the page. His mother's hand shook only once, at the part where someone had typed guardian signature, and then steadied. "You take your own mind," she said, meeting his eyes. "Not theirs. Yes, when needed. No, when must." The week pivoted quietly toward Thursday. Days became lists. Socks rolled, a shirt that almost fit. Mr. Harris brought over a second-hand blazer, and James stood in front of the mirror above the sink to see what borrowed dignity looked like on him. The mirror was spotted from years of water and time, but it told the truth. A thin boy with dark hair and eyes a shade too honest, climbing into a world that did not own his shape. At night, James returned to the barn to practice, not with brilliance but with patience. He set the bolts and buttons, then turned them back to their starting squares and tried again. He rehearsed silence, how to breathe while men with soft shoes filled rooms with their voices. He rehearsed stillness, how to keep hands from betraying what the mind had not yet decided. He rehearsed refusal, how to let a free pawn sit on a square like a coin glinting in dust and not touch it. Mr. Harris visited in the evenings, bringing not more openings but fewer. "When in doubt," he said, drawing a thin arrow from a blocked file to an open one, "improve your worst piece, or your worst thought." He sketched a diagram of irrigation ditches in the margin of a chess book, and James watched as the lines became channels, then as channels became ideas. "Pressure is a budget," Mr. Harris murmured. "Spend it where it buys you time." On Wednesday, word had already begun its small-town work. People at the feed store looked at James as if he had sprouted a second shadow. Connor's father, the banker, paused at the gas pumps longer than the tank required and said to Thomas, "City folks will eat your boy alive." Thomas wiped his hands on a rag and answered with farmer wisdom, "They'll choke if they don't chew." That night, 2 pies arrived unannounced. Tulia did not know what to do with a prodigy, but it knew what to do with an occasion. Thursday began with the color of tin. The car from Amarillo arrived with clean tires that had never met real mud. The driver wore a tie as if it were a leash. He loaded a suitcase that held almost nothing, because James did not own much to load, and he held the door like a ritual he'd been paid to perform. The ride felt more like being delivered than driven. Fields slid past, their rows as precise as lines in a proof, their parched soil and argument too long ignored. At the airport, metal detectors chirped at everyone equally. James looked out at the runway and thought how chess teaches you the same gravity that keeps planes honest. Mr. Harris gripped the armrest of the airplane so tightly that his knuckles whitened like chalk. "In chess, we call this a loss of control position," he said when the plane tilted skyward. "Then why play it?" James asked. "Because the board is bigger than our table," Mr. Harris replied, and tried on a smile that fit only halfway. Above the clouds, the land disappeared and left only the idea of it. James stared out the window until the sky turned from cotton to slate. He imagined the pieces in his backpack, the carved horses wrapped in dishcloth. They were ordinary things, weight in the world, but inside his mind they were more. A grammar of survival, a way to move in rooms where nobody expected him to know the verbs. He slept in fits, waking to the engine's thin animal hum, to the cart's soft rattle, to the announcements that turned people back into passengers. When the plane dipped, Manhattan rose, an equation written in glass and river, in bridges arcing like parentheses nobody dared close. They were met by a woman with a sign that said Carter in confident capitals. The terminal glowed in that way places glow when they have never been afraid of their own brightness. The woman led them to a car that smelled faintly of leather and money. Buildings rose around them and then above them, until the sky became a suggestion. The hotel Laura had chosen was a vertical argument for itself. The lobby wanted to be a temple, or perhaps already was, given how quietly people moved in it, as if confessing the price per night in whispers. In the room, on the bed, lay a garment bag and a note in a slanted economical hand. "This will do. Meet me at 6. James unzipped the bag and found a suit the color of night without stars. It fit the way city clothes fit country boys. Almost. Mr. Harris wore his own suit, brushed as carefully as a prized mare before a fair. He retied his tie, then retied James's, tightening the knot with the gentleness of men who remember teaching a child to lace boots. "Remember," he said, smoothing the lapel as if it were a creased thought, "manners are openings. And if you cannot see tactics, improve your worst square." They met Laura beneath a chandelier that looked like a frozen galaxy. Up close, her calm revealed itself as economy. Not a shred of gesture wasted, not a glance spilled. "James, Mr. Harris," she said, and the way she said their names made them sound already scheduled. "You're on time? Good." The elevator whisked them upward with the confidence of a calculation already done. James felt the shift in his ears, the pressure equalizing. He thought of water rising in a pipe, how you must honor what pressure wants, or it will find its own way through you. When the doors opened, a hallway received them the way a chessboard receives knights, at an angle, silently, as if that had always been the path. On the way down that corridor, James understood something that would not leave him for years. Men like Harrow and women like Laura do not always announce the game they're playing. Sometimes the board is the table. Sometimes it's the room. Sometimes it is you. At the penthouse door, Laura used a key that did not look like a key. The lock clicked with a sound both polite and final. Inside lay a view of the city so complete it made maps feel like gossip. Glass reached sky, sky reached glass back. The air smelled not of anything in particular, but of the absence of everything particular. Citrus, perhaps. Money, certainly. James did not step to the window. He lifted his backpack instead, feeling the familiar drag of the flour sack and the carved knights. He set the bag down carefully, as if placing a hand on a sleeping animal. "Victor arrives at 6:30, Laura said. "Mr. Harrow soon after." Mr. Harris nodded, the movement modest, an amen in a church he did not fully trust. James touched the top of the bag with 2 fingers. The gesture was nothing. The gesture was everything. He could not control the room, the views, the people who bought views and rooms, but he could choose where to place his hands. He could choose to carry weight rather than pretend he had none. He breathed once, twice, the way he did before releasing water into a furrow. Not yet the game, not yet the fight. This was the part on the farm when you listen, to wind, to soil, to a father's footsteps coming up behind you with advice that sounds like rebuke only if you are young. He listened now, to the hum of the building's veins, to the city's distant tidal breath, to Mr. Harris's quiet whisper. "Openings are promises. Keep yours." In that precise, almost sacred pause before the first move, James Carter stood in the highest room he had ever been allowed into, a farm boy carrying a board made from a flour sack, and felt the old truth render itself new. Water finds its course. So will he. New York rose like a theorem written in steel and glass. From the car window, James watched it sharpen, bridges stretching like parentheses across the Hudson, towers stabbing into the sky with the indifference of proof. Nothing in Tulia reached higher than a grain silo. Here, even the shadows climbed. Laura Kensington moved through it all as though the city were merely an extension of her pulse. She led them into a hotel that resembled a cathedral, that had forgotten faith but kept the architecture. Marble floors reflected light so clean it felt almost chemical. Chandeliers arched above them, constellations of glass deliberately frozen in place. The receptionist spoke Laura's name like an equation already balanced. Keys appeared. Their bags were lifted by men who never asked. James stood still in the lobby, dizzy from ceilings that did not apologize for being tall. He reached instinctively for his backpack, the flour sack and carved knights inside, and touched it the way a farmer touches the gate before entering a strange field, quietly, to remind himself he belonged. In the hotel room, folded with military precision, lay a garment bag. A note in Laura's hand rested atop it. "This will do. Meet me at 6. The suit inside was black, sharp enough to cut him from the boy he knew. The jacket fit poorly at the shoulders, the sleeves hung just above his wrists. But the shoes, polished leather, never acquainted with dust, felt like trespass. James slid them on anyway, standing at an awkward angle between 2 lives. Mr. Harris wore his own suit, pressed so firmly the threads seemed to stand at attention. He had brushed it until fabric gave a faint sheen, a last act of devotion from a man who had lived long enough to know appearances were opening moves. In the mirror above the sink, he tied James's tie with the patience of a carpenter fitting joints. "Manners," he said. "Remember, in chess, touch move. In life, it's much the same." James nodded, though his throat felt tight. He had memorized lines from Capablanca and Fisher, but there were no books teaching how to walk across carpets worth more than a year of cotton yield. At 6 sharp, Laura appeared beneath the chandelier in the lobby. Her calm was unnerving. It seemed to have been bought wholesale, ironed into her every gesture. "James? Mr. Harris," she greeted, as if she were already signing them into a ledger. "They're waiting." The elevator ascended without hurry, silent except for the changing numbers. James felt pressure in his ears. The motion reminded him of wells being primed, of water forced upward through resistant stone. He thought, pressure is always real, whether in pipes, in soil, or in rooms built higher than reason. The doors opened onto a hallway lined with art that looked like unsolved equations. At the far end, a door waited, guarded only by quiet. Laura inserted a key that did not look like a key. The lock clicked once, polite but final. The penthouse swallowed them. Floor-to-ceiling windows carved Manhattan into obedient rectangles of light and river. Furniture gleamed with words James did not know yet. Sconce, credenza, provenance, but recognized as belonging to a language designed to exclude him. The air smelled of citrus, money, and the absence of need. A small crowd had already gathered, men and women in suits that whispered rather than spoke, holding crystal as if it were a continuation of their hands. Conversation paused when James entered, not because of who he was, but because he was not expected. In places like this, the unexpected was the only true spectacle. At the center stood a table, a pedestal of black wood polished until it could reflect conscience. Upon it lay a chess set of ivory and ebony, carved so finely that each piece seemed to breathe. Beside it, an antique clock waited, its cream face and brass hands poised to measure a different kind of wealth. Time. Viktor Reznov was there already. He was taller than photographs suggested, shoulders straightened by decades of posture before the board. His hair had surrendered to silver, but his profile remained sharp, cut by years of analysis. When he turned toward James, his eyes were not cruel nor indulgent. They were clinical, the gaze of a man who had dissected thousands of positions and expected to dissect this one too. "You brought your set," Reznov said. His accent was the sound of frost over stone. "Yes, sir," James replied. He lifted his backpack, setting it carefully beside the polished board. "Good," Reznov said, nodding toward it. "The first thing a player learns to carry is weight." Laura made the introductions as if dealing cards. "Mr. Harrow," she said, "this is James Carter from Texas." The man who turned at his name had the face of advertisements that sell trust. His handshake was brief, efficient, uninterested in proving strength he already assumed. His smile was the geometry of returns rising on a chart. "We keep a salon here," Harrow said. "Chess, conversation, sometimes commerce. Victor supervises the board. I supervise the rest." He did not laugh at his own line. Command never needed decoration. Mr. Harris had been given a chair near the wall and a glass of water, as if to acknowledge him politely but remind him of the margins he occupied. He sat with hands folded, posture saying witness while the room insisted audience. "Let's begin," Harrow said. The crowd rearranged themselves like pieces falling into an opening. James placed the flour sack across the black pedestal. Buttons, bolts, and washers found their squares. The hush that followed was the kind men used when hiding laughter. But Reznov did not laugh. He studied the improvised set the way geologists study stones that reveal entire mountains. He inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to respect. "Black," Reznov said, gesturing. "Everyone wants white. Bad habit." James set his knights on B8 and G8, small horses from Tulia placed onto a battlefield of glass. Reznov opened 1.D4, claiming the center with the authority of a man who had claimed many. James replied NF6, then G6, then BG7. The king's Indian defense hummed to life, a shape James knew not as notation, but as heartbeat. Concession first, explosion later. The crowd watched, amused at the novelty, confident in the inevitable. At move 8, Reznov adjusted a bishop that did not need adjusting. The gesture was not for the piece, but for the boy, a test of nerves. James's fingers trembled once, then steadied. "How pressure flows," he whispered, barely audible. He placed a pawn not for glory, but for necessity. Reznov's eyes flickered, not surprise, not admiration, but something subtler, acknowledgement. Dinner was announced. Harrow smiled sharply. "Adjourned," he said. The board froze. but tension did not. Reznov set the clock aside. We resume after supper. James rose, reluctant. I'm not tired, he admitted. Good, Reznov replied. Fatigue blurs truth. Laura appeared beside him, calm as a margin note. Listen more than you speak at dinner, she instructed. That table is just another board. Mr. Harris brushed a phantom speck from James's shoulder. Every move improve what you have, he murmured, as if chalking an equation too faint for the others to see. They walked toward the dining room rimmed with silver and crystal. Behind them, the flour sack board rested on black wood, bolts and buttons defiant against ivory. Manhattan glittered outside, arrogant and unsleeping. James Carter followed billionaires toward supper and felt, with the clarity of water following grade, that the opening was over. The middle game, the one where threats grow teeth and cascades begin, was about to start. The dining room gleamed like a theory in silver. Polished forks and crystal glasses caught the light, scattering it across linen as white as resignation. Men spoke in clipped tones about markets and mergers, while women in dresses of quiet wealth leaned in with the efficiency of people trained never to waste words. James sat between Mr. Harris and Laura, shoulders straight, silence clamped like a piece held in reserve. Laura had told him, "The table is just another board." He listened. He watched. He moved nothing but his eyes. They spoke of acres, of consolidations, of debt portfolios shifting like pawns on ledgers. James heard Tulia in every syllable. When one man laughed about family farms folding themselves into the balance sheet, James's chest tightened. Soil, to them, was not earth. It was a line item. He imagined the sound of cracked wells, his father's silence at the kitchen table. The food in front of him tasted of nothing. Mr. Harris leaned toward him once, whispering, "Patience. Openings aren't won. They're prepared." James nodded. He knew patience. He had practiced it under sun and drought, waiting for water that sometimes never came. Dinner ended not with dessert, but with a signal. Harrow's glass tapped once against the table. Chairs slid back. Conversation thinned to murmurs. And the crowd flowed back into the salon, to the board that waited like judgment. The penthouse lights dimmed slightly. The board was no longer ornament. It was altar. The flour sack rested across polished ebony, bolts and buttons marking territory against ivory carved when empires were young. James sat. Reznov sat opposite, face as still as glass. The antique clock ticked alive. 1.D4 had already been played. James's knight on F6 was a promise. Now came 2G6, the beginning of the king's Indian defense, a structure James trusted the way farmers trust the stubborn return of seasons. Reznov answered with calm efficiency, C4, NC3, BE2, a slow tightening of space. The room quieted. Even billionaires knew when ritual mattered. Each move was its own sound. Bishop to G7, like a door opening. Castles, like bolts sliding home. The game was taking shape, and the watchers leaned in. Reznov pressed, expanding in the center. James allowed it, pawns pushing forward like men staking claims. To onlookers it seemed passive. To James it was irrigation, pressure guided, not resisted. At move 8, Reznov adjusted a piece that didn't need adjusting. A bishop, touched and released, not a mistake, a gesture, a reminder that patience frays. "You study?" Reznov asked, eyes never leaving the board. "I try," James said. His voice was steady, though his heart drummed. "What do you try to learn?" "How pressure flows," James replied, before varnish could soften the truth. Harrow chuckled, low, dismissive. Poetry. Farmers always mistake patience for wisdom. James placed a pawn forward. A button, smooth from years in his mother's jar, slid into the center. His eyes lifted once, only once. Patience isn't wisdom, he said quietly. It's survival. A murmur rippled around the room. Reznov's lips did not move, but his eyes flickered. For the first time, he recognized not just a boy, but a voice. The game thickened. Reznov advanced, his pawns claiming the center like walls of glass. James coiled behind, knights crouched, bishops biding time. Spectators saw passivity. Reznov saw preparation. Then Harrow's voice, pitched for a companion, carried across the hush. 200,000 acres by next quarter. Families default. Land folds itself neatly. A pity they never understood timing. The words pressed into James's spine. His fingers froze above the board. Acres. Families. Timing. The game was camouflage, the board a mask for theft. He understood now. The moves around him were not just wood on squares. They were lives being signed away in other rooms. Reznov moved a queen, sliding across diagonals with predatory grace. James responded, quiet but firm, rook to E8. Not a strike, an anchor. He thought of irrigation ditches, build the channel first, then let water carry the rest. At move 12, Reznov offered temptation, a pawn left undefended, glinting like a coin in dust. Gasps whispered from the crowd. Surely the boy would take it. James's hand hovered. His pulse raced. He remembered Mr. Harris's warning. No pawn is free. Every gift has a price. He thought of water pooling in the wrong ditch, looking useful but starving the crop. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew his hand and played elsewhere. Reznov's eyes narrowed. Approval flickered, so faint it might have been missed. Harrow, however, scoffed aloud. Cowardice. The boy doesn't even see what's given. No, Mr. Harris whispered from his chair. He saw it, and he refused. The tension coiled tighter. Reznov's pieces closed in, elegant snares forming. James resisted with patient moves, improving a knight here, reinforcing a pawn there. It was not brilliance. It was refusal to collapse. The room shifted. The chandelier above gleamed like a frozen constellation, but the true light was on the board. Billionaires held their breath. Deals hovered in silence. The boy from Tulia sat straight-backed, his flour sack board defying ivory centuries old. At move 16, James pushed F5. Gasps rippled through the room. Aggressive. Risky. A 12-year-old declaring war in the center against a Grandmaster. The sluice had opened. Reznov leaned forward, silver brows drawn. So, he murmured, you release the water. He pressed his clock. The game flared. Tension broke open. Pawns clashed, diagonals lit. James's bolts and buttons rattled faintly with each placement, but his hands did not shake. He no longer saw men in suits, crystal in hands, or Harrow's disdain curling through the air. He saw channels, pressure, flow. Reznov probed with traps, each one glittering with the promise of advantage. James declined them all. Each refusal was its own move, a philosophy hammered into steel. By move 20, the shape of the board had changed. The billionaires did not see it, not yet. But Reznov did. His hand slowed. His eyes sharpened. Across from him, the boy was not collapsing. He was waiting. He was building. Interesting, Reznov said at last, his voice almost respectful. James touched the carved knight from Tulia, felt the smooth wood warmed by his palm, and placed it on E7. It crouched there, ready for the cascade he had begun to imagine. The penthouse air grew heavy. Manhattan glittered beyond glass, uncaring. But inside, 64 squares had become an empire at war, and a farm boy, carrying nothing but bolts and buttons, had dared to open the battle. The penthouse had grown smaller, not in size, but in air. The walls of glass still held Manhattan's skyline in glittering obedience, yet the weight of silence pressed harder than the towers outside. Every person in the room had forgotten their wine, their deals, their half-smiles. All eyes were fixed on 64 squares. Reznov leaned closer to the board. His posture had shifted, no longer leisurely, no longer certain. James Carter sat across from him, elbows still, hands folded above the flour sack stretched across polished ebony. The boy's face carried no arrogance, no gloating, only the stillness of someone guiding water and waiting for its course. The middle game had begun. Reznov struck first. A knight lunged into James's camp, its carved ivory edges gleaming under chandelier light. The crowd stirred. "It's over," one man whispered, confident in inevitability. James studied the position, fingers hovering above his washer bishop. He saw not threat, but pressure. Pressure could be redirected. He had learned that with a shovel in his hands, ankle deep in cracked earth, when water pooled in the wrong furrow. You don't fight the flood, you guide it. He slid his rook across. A quiet move, defensive on the surface, but one that tightened the channel. The watchers frowned. "Passive," muttered Harrow. But Reznov's eyes narrowed. He recognized refusal again. "You wait," Reznov said softly. "Waiting is dangerous." James did not look up. So is rushing. Move followed move. Pawns collided. Files opened. The board was no longer a map. It was a battlefield. Reznov's pieces pressed, elegant and relentless. James's bolts and buttons held, bending but not breaking. At move 23, Reznov set a trap. He offered an exchange, knight for bishop, that promised James the illusion of gain. A boy would grab it, they thought. A child would not resist. James's hand hovered, his breath catching. Then memory came back to him. A summer drought, water seeping toward weeds, his father's voice saying, "Improve what you have." He withdrew. Instead of capture, he advanced a pawn, a button sliding forward like a sluice opening in silence. Gasps rippled. Harrow scoffed, too loud. He doesn't see the gift in front of him. But Reznov's gaze sharpened. He did not speak, but in his eyes lived the rarest currency in the game: respect. The cascade was forming. James did not call it that, not yet, but he felt it. Each move was less about seizing than about guiding. Pawns supported one another. Rooks found hidden lines. Bishops angled like irrigation ditches, opening new channels. Pressure gathered in quiet corners, then shifted with sudden force. Mr. Harris saw it first. He gripped the arms of his chair, chalk-white knuckles trembling. To him, it was a revelation. Strategy not memorized, but lived. The boy was applying farm wisdom to chess, turning survival into theory. Reznov felt it too. For the first time, his hand slowed. He leaned back, then forward again, recalculating lines he had believed were certain. "This is not book," he muttered. "This is invention." But outside the board, danger brewed. Harrow's voice cut across the hush, pitched low to his associates. "By next quarter, 400,000 acres consolidated. Families default like pawns, easy. With Reznov as spectacle, no one notices until the ink is dry." James heard it. The words dug into him deeper than any knight or queen. He thought of Tulia's cracked wells, of his father's silence folding bank notices under salt shakers, of neighbors who prayed for rain but got drought. His jaw tightened. He placed a pawn forward, F4. A surge of pressure, aggressive, bold. The crowd stirred uneasily. "Too soon," whispered one. Reznov studied the boy. "You open the sluice again," he said. "Do you know the flood it brings?" James lifted his eyes, steady. "Sometimes the flood is the only way the roots drink." The board shifted violently. Reznov countered with precision, sacrificing a pawn to open diagonals. James met it, refusing greed, redirecting force. Queens crossed the board like predators circling. Rooks clashed, files opened, and the chandelier light glinted off sweat at Reznov's temple. The billionaires pressed closer, their amusement thinning into unease. What had begun as entertainment now bent into something else. A duel no money could soften. At move 30, James sacrificed a rook. Gasps tore through the room. "Blunder!" hissed someone. "The boy doesn't see!" But seconds later, the sacrifice revealed its purpose. A diagonal opened. His bishop roared to life, cutting across the board with sudden inevitability. Pressure cascaded, each piece feeding the next. Reznov froze. His lips pressed thin. He saw it. The sequence, the flow. The boy had created a system, not a trick, a cascade. Harrow slammed his glass down. Crystal cracked against wood. Shards scattering like fallen pawns. "Impossible!" he spat. "He's a farm child with scraps of metal." "No," Reznov said, his accent sharpened to steel. "He is a player. More than that." His eyes never left James. "He is an author." The room held its breath. James felt none of the grandeur they saw. He felt only the quiet rhythm of water finding its course, the truth that patience could outlast towers of glass. He guided one more move, knight to E6, leaping into the heart of Reznov's camp. The cascade had reached its flood. The chandelier burned above them, a frozen constellation. Outside, Manhattan glittered like an empire certain of itself. But inside the penthouse, certainty cracked. A farm boy from Tulia had turned irrigation ditches into a method of survival on 64 squares, and even Victor Reznov, Grandmaster of Glass Towers, was forced to recalculate. The middle game had become more than a contest. It was revelation. The board had grown loud without sound. Every watcher felt it, an invisible current coursing across the squares. Buttons, bolts, and carved knights stood where ivory and ebony should have dominated, yet it was the Grandmaster's position that bent under pressure. Reznov's fingers hovered over his queen. His eyes narrowed, recalculating lines he had once believed unbreakable. Sweat beaded faintly at his temple, caught by the chandelier's frozen constellation above. He had played champions in Paris, prodigies in Moscow, engines in laboratories, but never a farm boy who thought of pawns as sluices and rooks as rivers. James Carter sat opposite, still as dusk in the Texas fields. His breath came steady, his fingers light above the flour sack board. He no longer saw a game. He saw irrigation, pressure redirected, channels opening, water cascading from one move into the next. The cascade method had arrived, not theory, not memorized sequence, but lived necessity turned into art. At move 32, James sacrificed a pawn. Gasps rippled through the room. A boy throwing away what little he had? Foolishness, they thought. Yet the sacrifice opened a file, narrow, dangerous, alive. His rook slid into it with the inevitability of floodwater breaching a ditch. Reznov paused. His eyes flicked over the board, back and forth. He could counter the rook, but at cost. He could seize the pawn, but lose the diagonal. The cascade was forcing him, the way water forces stone to yield, not by strength, but by patience, Guido. "You are not memorizing," Reznov murmured. His voice was low, meant only for James. "You are writing." James didn't look up. "I'm surviving." Harrow's patience snapped. He stepped forward, his voice slicing through the hush. "Enough of this. Tricks and accidents. Reznov, end it. Show them what genius is worth." Reznov ignored him. His hand touched a knight, then retreated. "Genius is not always noise," he said, eyes still fixed on James. But Harrow turned to the crowd, his words dripping disdain. "Do you not see? The boy is nothing. While you sip your wine, my partners and I are finalizing deeds, 500,000 acres consolidated by the quarter. Farms like his fold into ledgers like this one." He snapped his fingers. An assistant produced papers, thick with contracts, embossed with seals. "That is power, not this child's parlor game." James's jaw tightened. He looked not at the papers, but at the board. Land didn't fold itself. He heard his father's voice, heavy with dust and silence. "Soil is life. Treat it like numbers and it dies." He placed his bishop forward, unleashing its long diagonal. It cut across the board with sudden ferocity, slicing into Reznov's camp. Gasps tore through the room. Ah! The cascade was no longer a murmur. It was flood. Reznov's lips parted in something rare, surprise. He pressed his clock with deliberate calm, though his eyes betrayed the effort of recalculation. He advanced his queen, seeking counterplay, but James met it with a knight leaping into e6. The carved horse from Tulia landed in the heart of ivory lines. The room erupted in whispers. "The boy has pierced the Grandmaster's fortress." Reznov sat back for a breath. His silver brows drew together, then lifted, as if conceding something privately. "This is not survival anymore," he said. "This is creation." James looked at him, steady. "Creation is survival. Where I come from, they're the same." The cascade rolled forward. James sacrificed again, another rook, another gasp. To onlookers, it was madness. To him, it was irrigation breaking ditch walls, redirecting the flood to where it mattered most. His bishop sprang alive. His queen advanced. Pressure mounted on Reznov's king, each piece feeding the next. Reznov tried to parry, countering with precise defense, his movements sharp as winter air. Yet the cascade had momentum now. Even a Grandmaster could feel it. Inevitability carried not by brilliance, but by flow. "Impossible," muttered one of Harrow's men, clutching his glass too tightly. Harrow himself had turned red. "This is theater," he barked. "A boy with buttons is not going to overturn towers of glass." James answered him without lifting his head. His voice was quiet, but it cut sharper than any rook. "Towers fall when you stop listening to the ground beneath them." The words lingered. The chandelier gleamed. Reznov's hand hesitated once more. Move by move, James pressed the cascade. His queen slid into position, supported by pawns that had seemed irrelevant 10 moves earlier. His knights leapt like eddies, rerouting current. Every refusal to grab a gift, every patient reinforcement, now came alive. Reznov's king staggered, forced into corners it had not chosen. The room held its breath. Men worth billions leaned forward, seeing their champions strained. Harrow slammed the papers onto the table beside the board. "This means nothing," he shouted. "While you watch him, I own your farms. His father's land, his neighbor's land. It is already signed away." James lifted his eyes at last. For a moment, the noise, the contracts, the suits, all vanished. He looked at Harrow and spoke words that would echo far beyond the penthouse. "Land doesn't fold itself. Someone takes it." The room froze. No one spoke. Even the antique clock seemed to hold its tick. Reznov's gaze shifted from the board to the boy. Something in him, hidden, old, stirred. He understood. The child wasn't merely fighting for 64 squares. He was exposing the board the billionaires thought invisible. James pushed his pawn, G5. Another sluice opened. The cascade was complete. Pressure that had built for 30 moves now burst across the board. Reznov countered, but his pieces strained. James advanced again, D5. Diagonal lines blazed open. His bishop struck like sunlight into a cellar. Gasps filled the room. Some clutched their glasses. Others muttered disbelief. But Mr. Harris leaned forward, eyes shining. He whispered only for himself. "He's doing it. He's breaking the board." Reznov placed his queen, desperate for counterplay. James slid his rook, bolts from a barn table, onto the open file. The Grandmaster's king stood exposed. Reznov exhaled, long and slow. His hand rested on the ivory king, warm against decades of discipline. He looked up at James, silver brows furrowed. "You cascade," he said, the word foreign yet fitting on his tongue. He tipped the king forward. Silence detonated. The Grandmaster had resigned. Chaos erupted. Some shouted into phones. Others cursed. Contracts rattled like leaves in storm. Harrow's face twisted in disbelief. But Reznov sat back, his gaze locked on James, and for the first time in years, the man who had broken countless prodigies smiled, not with derision, but with respect. "You broke the board," Reznov said quietly. James folded his hands, steady as water after flood. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He sat as if still in the barn beneath Texas stars, guiding channels only he could see. The cascade had been unleashed. And towers trembled. The chandelier still burned, but the room felt darker. Fragments of Harrow's shattered glass glittered on the polished floor like fallen pawns. The silence that followed Reznov's resignation was heavier than applause. Every eye in the penthouse was fixed on James Carter, a boy with dust still clinging to his shoes, who had just forced a Grandmaster to bow. Reznov leaned back, folding his hands, his king tipped in quiet surrender. His eyes, sharpened by decades of battle, did not look at the crowd or Harrow. They looked only at James. Respect, rare, reluctant, undeniable, rested there. But Harrow could not abide it. His voice cut the silence like a blade. "This means nothing," he barked. "A parlor trick. A child's stunt." Reznov was merciful. Reznov's reply was immediate, his Russian accent hard as frost. No, he was correct. He saw deeper. He nodded toward James. He earned it. The words stung sharper than the loss itself. The billionaires shifted, uneasy, men unaccustomed to being witnesses to anything but their own victories. James did not gloat. He sat with his hands folded, carved knights resting before him. His chest rose and fell slowly, the rhythm of someone who had guided a flood and survived it. He thought only of his father at the kitchen table, his mother folding patched clothes, the dry wells that coughed dust. Victory meant little if it did not reach them. So when Harrow turned on him, sneering, "Fine, boy, you've won a game. What do you want? Money? A scholarship? A new truck for your failing farm?" James lifted his eyes, steady, and answered with words that would leave scars. "I don't want your money. I want your promise." Double the wages of every worker who breaks their back on your land. Stop stealing farms from families. Give back what you already took." The room erupted. Laughter barked from one corner. Outrage flared from another. "Ridiculous!" shouted a man with a signet ring. "Childish!" spat another, wine sloshing from his glass. But Reznov did not laugh. Mr. Harris, silent until now, rose from his chair. His voice trembled, but it carried. "The boy is right. You treat soil as collateral. He treats it as life. And tonight, he proved which view has power." Laura Kensington moved then. Her phone was already in her hand, its screen glowing faintly. For weeks, she had warned Harrow's board about reputational risk, about optics, about the danger of arrogance in an age of restless cameras. Tonight she did not warn. She recorded. "You all heard him," she said, her tone clinical, cutting through chaos. "And you all heard yourselves." Harrow's head snapped toward her. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, dangerous. "Delivering truth," she replied, not looking at him. Her thumb pressed the screen. The video was already uploading, the penthouse already compromised. Harrow lunged forward, but it was too late. The clip was gone, digitized, eternal. The world would see a farm boy defeating a Grandmaster while billionaires plotted to devour America's soil. Panic rippled. Investors pulled out phones, hissing into them. Lawyers muttered about injunctions. A senator's aide slipped out to call Washington. What had been a private ritual of power had become evidence. Harrow slammed his fist onto the table, shaking the flour sack board. Bolts and buttons rattled, but James steadied them with his palms. He looked up, his voice calm. "Land doesn't fold itself. Someone takes it. And now everyone will know." The words struck harder than any checkmate. Even those who despised him felt the truth in their marrow. Reznov closed his eyes briefly, as though remembering something long buried. When he opened them, his voice was low, weary. "Listen to him. He has nothing, yet he has seen more than you with your billions." By midnight, the penthouse had fractured. Men who had never admitted fear in their lives whispered of subpoenas. Harrow stormed from the room, shouting orders no one obeyed. Laura remained still, her gaze fixed on James as though recalculating her own position. Mr. Harris guided the boy gently toward the door. The antique clock still ticked, but the ritual was over. The marble tower had cracked, and everyone knew it. Down in the hotel, the television screens had already begun their work. Headlines crawled in red. "Farm boy outsmarts Grandmaster in billionaire penthouse." "Leaked recording exposes land grab scheme." "Who owns the soil of America?" Clips from Laura's phone replayed endlessly. James refusing money, demanding justice, Reznov conceding with a nod of respect. The phrase "land doesn't fold itself. Someone takes it." Ran like scripture across feeds, quoted, reposted, turned into banners. Mr. Harris sat with cold coffee, shaking his head. "You've made yourself a symbol, James. That's heavier than checkmate." James hugged his backpack close, the carved knights inside. "I didn't want to be a symbol," he said quietly. "I just wanted them to stop." "That," Mr. Harris replied, "is how symbols are born." Back in Tulia, neighbors gathered at the Carter farm. Men with caps, women with flour still on their hands, children who had never touched a chessboard, all spoke the same word: pride. For once, it was not shame or silence that hung over their fields, but pride. And across America, farmers who had folded quietly under debt saw a boy's defiance broadcast in pixels. In Washington, senators demanded hearings. Stock prices tied to Harrow partners faltered. For the first time in decades, soil was not background. It was headline. In the quiet of his hotel room, James sat by the window, knees pulled to his chest. The city pulsed outside like a living machine, but he did not watch it. He unfolded the flour sack, set out his bolts, buttons, and carved knights. He touched each piece with the reverence of someone handling seeds. Reznov's voice lingered in his mind. You broke the board. But James knew the truth. He hadn't broken it. He had shown it was already broken. And tomorrow, the world would decide whether to rebuild. The storm did not begin with thunder. It began with headlines. By dawn, every major network in America had picked up the footage. A farm boy from Tulia, Texas, defeating Viktor Reznov in a Manhattan penthouse while billionaires muttered about swallowing 500,000 acres. The video spread faster than grain fires in summer wind. By breakfast, London and Tokyo were running it beside market reports. By noon, Washington had called for hearings. The phrase had become prophecy. Land doesn't fold itself. Someone takes it. It ran across banners, hashtags, protest signs. Farmers in Iowa and Kansas lifted it like scripture. Newspapers printed it above photographs of barns with collapsing roofs, wells that coughed dust, families staring into cameras with eyes that said, "We are still here." In New York, Harrow's tower trembled. Investors fled, phones ringing with panic. Partners who had toasted him only nights before now distanced themselves with surgical speed. His lawyers filed injunctions to block Laura's video, but the clip was already mirrored on 1,000 servers, translated into dozens of languages. The harder he fought to bury it, the louder it grew. Inside his boardroom, Harrow slammed papers across the table. "It was a game!" he roared. "A child with buttons!" But one director, pale and sweating, whispered what the others feared. "The problem isn't the boy, it's the mirror. He made the country see what we are." Silence followed, heavier than argument. Harrow's empire had cracked, not from storms or markets, but from the reflection of itself in 64 squares. Reznov withdrew from the noise. For 3 days, he did not speak to press, nor to billionaires desperate for explanations. He stayed in a small apartment above a bookstore in Queens, the kind of place that smelled of dust and forgotten ink. He replayed the game in his mind, over and over. Each sacrifice, each refusal, each cascade. He had beaten champions, humiliated prodigies, endured engines that calculated deeper than men. Yet none had shaken him like the patience of a boy from Texas. He heard James's words echo, "Creation is survival." For the first time in decades, Reznov opened an old notebook. Its pages were filled with analysis, not for patrons, not for money, but for himself. He wrote one line at the top of a fresh page, "The Carter Cascade." He underlined it once, then sat back. His hands trembled, not from age, but from recognition. He had witnessed invention. In Washington, the storm sharpened. Senators from farm states seized the story with both hands. Hearings were scheduled. Photographs of James's flour sack board appeared on the floor of Congress. Bolts and buttons projected onto marble walls. One senator declared, "If a boy in dusty shoes can see what billionaires refuse, then the soil of America deserves better guardianship than balance sheets." Lobbyists scrambled. Banks whispered about reform. For once, the voice of forgotten farmers had breached the dome of power, not through lobbying, not through votes, but through a boy's refusal to take a free pawn. James watched it all from a hotel room. Mr. Harris tried to shield him from the avalanche of reporters outside, but news seeped through cracks. Anchors calling him the boy prophet of Tulia. Commentators debating whether his demand, that Harrow double wages and return stolen land, was naive or revolutionary. James ignored them. He sat cross-legged on the carpet, the flour sack unrolled, the carved knights resting in his palm. He played alone, whispering moves like prayers. "You've become a symbol," Mr. Harris said gently. James shook his head. "I'm still a farm kid. Symbols don't fix wells." "Maybe not," Mr. Harris said, his voice tender. "But they can make the world listen long enough for wells to be fixed." Laura visited once more before their return to Texas. She stood in the doorway, her calm as polished as ever, but her eyes carried something different now. Not calculation, but recognition. "You should know," she said. "Harrow will not forget this. Men like him rebuild. They shift, they hide, they return." James looked at her. "Then I'll be ready." She almost smiled. "I underestimated you once. I won't again." She handed him a folded document. Inside was a scholarship offer from a foundation that had nothing to do with Harrow. "Take it or don't. But understand, you've already been drafted into a larger game." James closed the folder without answering. His hand rested instead on the carved knight in his pocket. "I already have a game." The return flight to Texas felt different. Reporters shouted questions through glass, cameras flashing. James kept his head down, holding the backpack close. In the plane, Mr. Harris sat with a weariness that was not just age, but history, knowing too well how towers fall, how empires rebuild. "You shook them," Mr. Harris said softly. James turned toward the window, watching clouds drift below. "Did I?" "Yes," Mr. Harris replied. "But storms don't end with one strike. They spread." James thought of Tulia's dry fields, of his father's tired shoulders, of neighbors who patched clothes and stretched meals. He thought of Reznov in silence, Laura with her phone, Harrow's fury. The storm had spread, yes, but whether it would rain on the fields or only wash towers clean remained uncertain. When they landed in Amarillo, the air smelled of dust and cut hay. James breathed it like a homecoming hymn. Neighbors were waiting, not with cameras, but with handshakes, pies, and quiet pride. Thomas Carter stood by the truck, his shoulders still bent, but his eyes shining in a way James had never seen. His mother's hands trembled as she pulled him into an embrace, whispering, "You brought water, even if only words." James nodded, holding back tears. He wanted no headlines, no titles, only survival. That night, in the barn, beneath stars older than empires, he unrolled the flour sack again. He placed the bolts and buttons carefully, set the knights where they belonged, not for reporters, not for senators, for himself. The lantern flickered. The cascade method lived on, not in marble towers, not in hearings, but in the hands of a boy who believed survival could be creation. And outside, the storm spread. The first night back in Tulia was darker than New York had ever been. No towers glowed, no glass walls bent light into permanence. Only stars, familiar, countless, old as the soil itself. James lay awake in the barn, lantern flickering beside him, the flour sack unrolled, bolts and buttons set in their squares. The carved knights waited in his palms. The storm had spread across the world, but here in Tulia the air smelled the same: dust, hay, diesel from tractors that coughed more than they ran. And yet something invisible had shifted. Neighbors came the next morning. They arrived not as reporters, but as men and women who had carried the same weight as the Carters for decades. Old Mr. Lyle brought a pie, though he had little flour left. Mrs. Ortega, sleeves rolled from milking, clasped James's hand as if it were rope. "You said what we couldn't," she whispered. Her eyes shone, half pride, half exhaustion. "And now they have to hear us." Others followed, filling the yard with voices that had once been whispers. Farmers spoke of bank notices, of wells running dry, of land lost not to weather, but to contracts. For once, their grief was not solitary. It was collective. And James, barely 12, found himself at the center of it, not because he sought it, but because he had named it aloud. Inside, Thomas Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of letters. Only this time, they were not all threats. Some were postponements, banks cautious in the wake of hearings. One bore the seal of a senator's office promising investigation. Another carried an offer from a cooperative, support, if they could hold on. Thomas exhaled, long and low. "They're scared," he said. His voice was not triumph, but astonishment. "For once, it isn't us afraid of them." James stood by the window, looking out at fields that had forgotten rain. "It won't last," he said quietly. "Men like Harrow rebuild." His father nodded. "Maybe. But you gave them pause. And sometimes pause is enough to plant something new." That evening, James walked the fields. The rows were thin, stalks brittle, earth cracked like an old book's spine. He carried a spade, not for labor but for comfort, its weight familiar. He stopped by the dry ditch where water had once flowed and crouched, dragging the spade through soil. He imagined channels again, how one small shift could guide the flood, if ever it came. Behind him, soft footsteps. Mr. Harris approached, hat in hand. "Still seeing chess in furrows?" he asked gently. James shrugged. "It's the only way I know how to think." Mr. Harris knelt beside him. "Good. Because they'll come again. Contracts, acquisitions, all the old tricks. And when they do, you'll need to remember, patience is a weapon as sharp as any sword." James turned the spade once more, watching dust scatter. "I don't want to be a weapon." "Neither did the plow," Mr. Harris said. "But it broke empires of weeds all the same." Days passed. Reporters still prowled the edges of Tulia, but the town learned to treat them like stray dogs, tolerated, ignored, eventually sent away. The real changes were slower. A letter from Washington announcing hearings, an article in the Times calling James the prodigy prophet of farmland, a call from a university in Boston asking about scholarships. James read none of them. He spent his hours in the barn, replaying positions, refining his cascade. He discovered variations he hadn't seen before, moves that mirrored the way water shifted under new pressure. He filled a notebook with diagrams, arrows, channels, cascades. On the first page, in shaky hand, he wrote, "Patience creates inevitability." Reznov's words returned often. "You are writing." James did not yet know what he was writing, only that the method was not his alone. It belonged to every farmer who had waited for rain, every child who had survived by refusing a false gift. One evening, his mother found him in the barn. She carried a lantern, the glow painting her face with both pride and worry. "James," she said softly, "you've changed the way people see us." "But I need you to remember, you are still a boy. Don't let them take that from you." James set down a night, its cedar faint under his palm. "I don't feel like a boy anymore." Her hand cupped his cheek, rough from labor but tender. "Then fight to keep what's left. Even when you carry the weight of men twice your age, find something that belongs only to you." James nodded. He did not know yet how to obey, but he knew her words were truth, as heavy as any rook. By the end of the week, The Carter farm was no richer, no greener, no freer from drought. Yet there was something new. Visitors. Young reporters from Austin who asked not about contracts, but about soil. A group of students who had driven hours to see the boy with the flour sack board. A senator's aide who listened as Thomas Carter spoke about water rights, nodding as though his words mattered. The farm had not been saved, but it had been seen. And sometimes, visibility was the first kind of salvation. That night, James returned to the barn. He placed his pieces carefully, bolts and buttons clicking against wood. He looked up through gaps in the roof at stars that had watched empires rise and fall. "The board can be broken," he whispered into the silence. "Even towers can fall." He began another cascade, guiding each piece not for victory but for endurance. And as he played, he felt something larger than himself move through the night, a current spreading, a storm still gathering. The soil had heard. The world had heard. And James Carter, farm boy of Tulia, knew the game was not over. The hearings in Washington opened under marble domes that had seen centuries of promises. Cameras lined the walls, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Farmers from Iowa, Kansas, and Texas filled the gallery seats, men in worn boots, women with aprons still dusted with flour, children who carried the weight of debt in their silence. And on the witness table sat documents embossed with Harrow Partners' seal, contracts that spoke more cruelly than any witness could. Harrow himself arrived, face rigid, suit immaculate. But his empire had already cracked. Investors had fled, markets had punished him, and now the country stared. He raised his right hand to take the oath, but his eyes betrayed fury, not at the system, but at the boy who had forced him here. James Carter did not testify. He was 12. Symbols rarely speak in marble halls. They are spoken of. Senators quoted his words as if scripture. Land doesn't fold itself. Someone takes it. They replayed Laura's video, the cascade of moves, Reznov's resignation, the demand for justice from a boy with buttons for pawns. Every replay tightened the noose on Harrow's empire. Reznov sat quietly in the gallery. The silver-haired Grandmaster had crossed an ocean of time to be here, not as defender of Harrow, but as witness to something larger. He wore no tie, only a plain suit that made him indistinguishable from the crowd, until cameras found him. When asked for comment, he said only, "The boy did what no champion has done. He reminded me why we play." His words rippled outward. For decades, Reznov had been a shadow behind billionaires' power. Now, with a single sentence, he stepped back into humanity. Some whispered betrayal, others whispered absolution. Reznov did not care. His eyes, sharper than age should allow, looked toward Texas. The hearings ended with resolutions. Committees pledged to review land acquisitions. Banks promised temporary freezes on foreclosures. None of it was immediate salvation. But the seed had been planted. And seeds, James knew, could outlast storms. Back in Tulia, the farm breathed differently. Not wealthier, not greener, yet lighter. Neighbors spoke with voices unshackled from silence. Pledges of support arrived. Donations from cooperatives, letters from strangers across the country. The Carters were no longer invisible. One evening, as the sun bled red over the plains, Reznov himself arrived. His car, old and unpolished, stood out more than if it had been gold. He stepped into the barn, where James knelt over the flour sack board. The lantern flickered between them. "You taught me something," Reznov said. His voice was low, softened by distance from towers of glass. "I came to measure you. Instead, you measured me." James looked up wary. "Why did you ever play for them?" Reznov paused. His eyes carried winters too heavy to name. Survival. Even masters survive. But survival without creation is only death delayed. He stepped closer, placing a notebook on the crate. Its cover was worn, pages crowded with diagrams. This is yours. I call it the Cascade. James touched it with reverence, fingers trembling. Inside, lines of squares, arrows, annotations filled pages, Reznov's hand mapping the boy's invention. Not theft. Tribute. You are not just a survivor, Reznov said. You are an author. Carry it carefully. James swallowed, unable to speak. The Grandmaster inclined his head, then turned, his silver profile framed by lantern glow. Towers will rise again, he warned. But remember, the board can always be broken. Then he was gone. That night, James sat beneath the stars, the notebook open on his lap, the carved knights in his hand. He heard cicadas humming, cattle shifting in distant fields, his father's boots crunching gravel outside. The Cascade was no longer just his method. It was a map for others, a weapon against inevitability, a hymn for survival. Mr. Harris joined him, settling into a chair with a sigh. What now, James? They'll want you in universities, in cities, on stages. James set a pawn on the board. A button gleamed faintly in lantern light. I want to be here. You'll be both, Mr. Harris said gently. Here and there, soil and city, farm and board. That's the burden of symbols. James nodded, though his eyes stayed on the pawn. He whispered almost as prayer, Water finds its course. So will justice. Weeks later, the frenzy quieted. Reporters left. Headlines faded into other storms. But the phrase remained carved into memory. Land doesn't fold itself. Someone takes it. Farmers repeated it at co-op meetings. Students quoted it in classrooms. Senators echoed it in speeches. And in Tulia, a boy still unrolled a flour sack at night, bolts and buttons clinking softly in a barn filled with dust and hope. He studied new cascades, not for victory alone, but for survival, for creation, for the dignity of soil. The board was never just 64 squares. It was the world. And James Carter, son of a forgotten farmer, had shown that even the smallest piece, guided with patience, could overturn empires. On the last page of Reznov's notebook, James added his own line, scrawled in uneven hand beneath diagrams of cascades. Even towers fall, but soil endures. He closed the book, blew out the lantern, and lay back on the barn floor, stars above him eternal. The storm had spread, the cascade had begun, and the boy from Tulia was ready for the games yet to come. Thank you for walking with James Carter's story, a forgotten farm boy who showed the world that even empires can fall, and even soil has a voice. If this story moved you, please subscribe, share, and leave a comment. Every word you write is like water feeding the stream. Together, we keep these lights alive for those who still fight in silence.